I was reading through the opening of our source material last night, and there's this description of the Middle East in like the early 70s that it felt almost unrecognizable, like I was reading about a different planet.
Unrecognizable how? What was it that stood out?
Just the texture of daily life. The book talks about people debating Marxism in crowded bars in Beirut late into the night, university students having mixed-gender picnics on the banks of the Tigris in Baghdad, people reciting poetry in Peshawar. It just sounded messy and vibrant and
Intolerant. That's the key word Kim Ghattas uses in her book, Black Wave. It was a world where you could have different ideas, different faiths, different lifestyles, all existing side by side without this constant threat of violence.
Right. And then you compare that mental image to the headlines we see today, sectarian violence, these rigid theocracies, this intense religious policing, and you can't help but ask the question that apparently haunts the whole region now. Simple question, but man, it is heavy. What happened to us?
It is the question. And to answer it, we're doing a deep dive today into Black Wave. And honestly, this isn't just a history lesson. It's almost like a detective story.
A detective story where the victim is, well, an entire region's culture, I guess.
Precisely. The mission of this deep dive is to try and uncover how one specific rivalry, the one between Saudi Arabia and Iran, didn't just change politics. It actually, unraveled the cultural fabric of the Middle East. It turned neighbors into enemies, and it replaced that poetry you mentioned with sectarian hate.
And the craziest part is that the source material points to one specific year. One year where everything just goes completely off the rails. The fateful year of 1979.
1979. It's the turning point. In the book, Ghattas basically treats it as year zero for the modern Middle East.
So let's unpack this. Why 1979? I mean, things can happen in clusters, but this seems like a lot for just 12 months.
It was a perfect storm. You had a collision of three massive events that happened almost independently, but together they created this really toxic mix. First, the Iranian Revolution, the Shah falls, Ayatollah Khomeini rises. Second, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Which, down the line, becomes the training ground for global jihad.
Right. But the third event is one that I think a lot of people forget, or they just don't realize how pivotal it was. The Siege of the Holy Mosque in Mecca.
Okay, we're definitely going to have to dig into that because the siege in Mecca sounds absolutely wild. But the thesis here is that these events, they trigger a competition.
Yeah, exactly. A competition for Islamic leadership between Riyadh, that's Saudi Arabia, and Tehran. But, and here's where it gets really fascinating, this wasn't about borders or oil. It went deeper. It descended into a war for cultural and religious domination. They were trying to change societies from the inside out.
A battle for the soul of the region. So let's start with that first big domino, Iran.
The Iranian Revolution. Now, looking back, we tend to think of this as a purely religious takeover. We see the black robes, the beards, all of that. But the real irony, as Ghattas points out, is that the revolution was actually supported by secular leftists, by modernists, by intellectuals.
Wait, hold on. That doesn't make any sense. Why would people who want a progressive Iran help bring a theocracy to power?
Because they all hated the Shah. They saw him as a U.S. puppet, a despot. They thought Khomeini was just a figurehead, a kind of spiritual symbol who would help them overthrow the dictator. And then, and this is the tragic part, they thought he'd just go back to his seminary and let them run the country.
They did not read the fine print.
They definitely did not. But what stands out to you about how Khomeini actually pulled this off? I mean, he was an old man in exile in Paris. He didn't have an army.
The cassette revolution. This part just blew my mind. We think of social media revolutions today, Twitter or Facebook toppling governments. Khomeini did it with cassette tapes.
It's a perfect example of using whatever technology is available to bypass state media.
But how does that even work physically? I mean, you can't just tweet a cassette tape.
It was basically a smuggling operation. Khomeini would record these fiery sermons in France, attacking the Shah, calling for a return to pure Islam. And those master tapes would be flown into Iran, and then duplication shops, I mean, literally people in their basements, would copy them thousands of times. They were passed hand to hand in the bazaars, so the Shah controlled the TV and the radio, but he couldn't stop the audio.
That is so incredibly cyberpunk in a really weird analog way. But once he took power, the vibe shifted fast. It wasn't the democracy the leftists were hoping for.
Almost overnight, the source material describes just an immediate erasure of culture. Music was banned. Khomeini called it, and I'm quoting, "no different from opium."
There's that vivid image in the book of the Revolutionary Guards hauling crates of vintage champagne and fine wine from the Intercontinental Hotel and just pouring millions of dollars worth of it into the street. It's such a visceral image, just flushing the old ways right down the gutter.
And it wasn't just wine. It was gender segregation, the execution of opponents, the imposition of this very specific, very dark vision of society.
Okay, so while Iran is turning into a theocracy, something equally insane is happening in Saudi Arabia. The Siege of Mecca, November 1979. I knew vaguely about this, but the details they're like something out of an action movie.
It's terrifying. Just imagine the holiest site in Islam, the Grand Mosque in Mecca. It's dawn. 50,000 pilgrims are praying. And suddenly, gunshots ring out. A group of zealots led by a man named Juhayman al-Otaibi chains the door shut.
And these weren't outsiders, right? These were insiders.
They were ultra-conservatives. Juhayman's claim was that the Mahdi, the sort of messiah-like figure in Islamic eschatology, had arrived. But his main point was political. He was challenging the Al Saud royal family's legitimacy. He was basically saying, you are corrupt, you're too westernized, you are not fit to be the custodians of this holy place.
So the Saudi royals are terrified. Their entire legitimacy is based on religion. And here's a guy with a gun saying they aren't religious enough. How did they react?
And this is the crucial moment. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where the Black Wave really gains momentum. The siege lasted 2 weeks. It was incredibly bloody. But once the Saudi state finally defeated the gunmen, they had a choice. They could have cracked down on extremism. They could have said, look where this intolerance leads.
But they didn't?
No. To prove their own religious credentials, especially with Khomeini over in Iran calling them camel grazers and illegitimate rulers, the Saudi state essentially adopted the zealots' demands.
Wait, hold on. They defeated the gunmen and then they implemented the gunmen's ideology.
Exactly. They decided the only way to survive was to become even more fundamentalist than the people who were attacking them. They empowered the ultra-conservative Wahhabi clerics to safeguard their throne.
So it's a competition for purity. You have Iran claiming leadership of the Muslim world through revolution, and then Saudi Arabia counters by exporting its own ultra-conservative brand of Islam to prove that they are the true leaders.
And that competition is the engine of the Black Wave. It becomes this race to the bottom of who can be the most restrictive, the most pure, and it just ends up darkening the entire region.
And this darkness, it didn't stay inside their borders. That's the whole exporting ideology part of our outline. It wasn't just troops. This was like cultural engineering.
Soft power warfare. Both countries used money and ideology. Let's look at Pakistan.
Yeah, Pakistan serves as such a tragic case study in the book. You had this dictator, General Zia-ul-Haq,
who was heavily supported by Saudi money. But look at the mechanism of the change. It wasn't just laws. Textbooks were rewritten to be intolerant, to demonize minorities. The entire film industry collapsed because cinemas were either shutting down or being attacked. You started seeing graffiti on walls saying Shia kafir, Shia infidels.
There's a human story here that really stuck with me. Mehtab Chanarashti. She was a TV anchor.
Right. And she witnessed this darkness falling in real time. It wasn't just politics. It was daily life. Suddenly there were bans on dancing. The wearing of saris, which is a traditional garment in South Asia, was discouraged because it was seen as Hindu or not Islamic enough. She describes this rise of fear in just daily interactions.
It's the small details that get you.
Yeah.
It's not just laws changing. It's the social pressure. It's looking over your shoulder. And then we move to Lebanon. Now, before 1979, this sectarian split between Sunni and Shia, it wasn't the defining feature of the region, was it?
Not in the violent political way we see it today. I mean, communities had coexisted for centuries. But this rivalry weaponized those identities. In Lebanon, the book follows the story of the Faz family.
Hani Faz. He was a Shia cleric.
And interestingly, he initially supported the Iranian Revolution. He thought it was about justice, but he grew disillusioned pretty quickly. She went to Iran and saw that it wasn't some universal Islamic utopia. It was driven by Persian nationalism and very narrow sectarian interests.
And his daughter, Badia. She comes back from Iran to Lebanon and finds her own community has just transformed.
She finds the Black Wave has reached home. The Shia community in Lebanon was veiling up, adopting Iranian cultural norms. The chador, that full body cloak, was replacing local dress. It was a visual shift. You could literally walk down a street in Beirut and see the geopolitics reflected in what women were wearing.
It's like a uniform being imposed on a culture. And speaking of culture wars, we have to talk about Egypt. This section really hit me hard because Egypt was historically the intellectual hub, right?
Absolutely. Egypt was the Hollywood and the Harvard of the Arab world. But after the assassination of President Anwar Sadat, another event linked to this rising tide of extremism, you see the rise of what Ghattas calls moneyed Islam.
Saudi petrodollars.
Exactly. But how did that money work? Well, it funded publishing houses. It funded mosques. But it came with strings attached. You had to promote the conservative Wahhabi view, and this led to an intellectual purge.
This is where the story gets really, really dark. I mean, we're talking about the assassination of secular writers like Farag Foda, the stabbing of a Nobel laureate, Naguib Mahfouz. But the story of Nasr Abu Zaid, that one felt like a nightmare.
A legal nightmare. Can you unpack that one for us? What happened to him?
So Nasr Abu Zaid was this Egyptian professor. He wasn't a radical. He was a scholar trying to interpret the Quran in a modern context. But because of this new atmosphere of intolerance, Islamist lawyers filed a lawsuit against him.
And the lawsuit claimed that his writings made him an apostate, someone who has left the faith.
And here's the kicker. The court agreed. And because he was declared an apostate, the court ruled that he could not remain married to a Muslim woman. They forcibly divorced him from his wife.
Think about that for a second. The state stepping into your bedroom, ending your marriage because of an academic paper you wrote?
And his wife didn't even want the divorce. They had to flee the country.
That is the black wave. It just engulfed intellectual freedom and made it dangerous to even think.
So we've got political shifts, cultural erasure, but then there's the physical erasure. This brings us to segment 3, the erasure of memory and heritage.
And this is where we go back to Mecca.
And we meet Sami Angawi.
Sami Angawi is a fascinating figure. He is a Saudi architect from the Hejaz region. That's the western part of Saudi Arabia where Mecca is. And the Hejaz has traditionally been more diverse, more cosmopolitan.
And Sami's fighting a losing battle against bulldozers.
Literally.
Yeah.
The Saudi state, driven by this strict Wahhabi ideology, viewed historical sites as potential sources of shirk idolatry. They believed people might start to worship the stones or the graves instead of God, so they just started destroying them.
We're talking about significant history here, like the house of one of the Prophet's companions, ancient mosques.
Gone. Turned to dust. Angawi was watching the physical history of Islam being wiped off the map. He called the new expansions soulless. They replaced this diverse, layered history with a sterile, concrete metropolis of luxury hotels and malls.
It's erasing the physical proof of a tolerant past. If you destroy the buildings, it's easier to rewrite the history and say, oh, it was always like this.
Precisely. It creates a vacuum that you can fill with a single, rigid narrative. If the physical evidence of diversity is gone, the memory starts to fade.
Now, there's another figure in the book who really personifies this whole timeline. Someone whose name, unfortunately, everyone knows now, Jamal Khashoggi.
Yes. Most people know Jamal Khashoggi because of his horrific murder in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in 2018. But Ghattas uses his life as an arc for the whole region.
Because he wasn't always the reformer we think of him as today.
No, not at all. In 1979, a young Khashoggi was swept up in this Islamist wave. He was a true believer. The book details how he was distributing anti-Shia pamphlets at his university. There's this one really poignant detail where he actually gave away all his music records because he'd come to believe they were sinful.
He drank the Kool-Aid?
He did. But his journey is the journey of the awakening. Over decades, he realized that this black wave had destroyed the tolerance of his youth. He transitioned into a reformer who wanted democracy, who wanted pluralism.
And the tragedy is that he was killed by the very system he once tried to serve, right as that system was claiming to modernize.
It's just a macabre twist. He was killed by a Saudi regime led by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman that was ostensibly fighting the old extremism, but using the same brutal tactics of repression. They were trying to silence a critic using the methods of the very darkness they claimed they were dispelling.
Which brings us to the legacy of all this. The book calls it the 1001 Nights of Politics because the stories just keep spawning new tragedies.
The rivalry mutated. It turned into these violent proxy wars we see today in Syria, Yemen, and Iraq.
And this idea of sectarianization.
That's key. Political power struggles were repackaged as these ancient Sunni versus Shia hatreds. It wasn't the norm before 1979, but it became the primary language of conflict. It's a very convenient mask for power grabs.
But here we are in the modern era, And we had this really weird paradox. You look at Saudi Arabia today with MBS. He says he wants to crush 1979.
He does. He's bringing in cinemas, concerts, entertainment, things that were banned for decades. He's trying to reverse the social restrictions.
So isn't that a good thing? Isn't that the wave finally receding?
It's complex. He's removing the religious restrictions, but he's maintaining severe political repression. So it's a kind of modernization without freedom. And over in Iran,
The population just seems tired.
exhausted. You have activists like Masih Alinejad fighting against the mandatory hijab. You have a population that has lived through decades of this ideology and is basically asking, what has this actually gotten us? We're poorer, we're isolated, and we're less free.
And that connects to the generational disconnect.
Yeah.
The book mentions young people in both countries asking their parents, why didn't you stop this? Why did you let the darkness in?
That's the heartbreaking question. The Black Wave left a legacy of lost time, lost art, lost tolerance. You know, political shifts can happen overnight. A king dies, a revolution happens, but you can't just snap your fingers and bring back a culture that was bulldozed.
So what does this all mean for us? Why does this story matter to someone sitting in New York or London or Tokyo?
Well, if we synthesize this, the whole concept of the Black Wave tells us that this wasn't just about leaders. It wasn't just Khomeini or King Fahd playing 40 chess. It was about millions of ordinary lives. Artists, teachers, architects like Angawi, whose worlds were just darkened. It shows how quickly a society can lose its way when fear takes over.
It's the loss of potential.
Exactly. And the source material suggests that while Saudi Arabia and Iran are locked in this fight to the death, the real tragedy is the loss of the middle way.
The middle way.
That pluralistic, diverse past. The Beirut, where you could debate Marxism, the Mecca that preserved its history, the Cairo where intellectuals were safe. That middle ground has been bulldozed, both literally and metaphorically.
And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Can that collective memory ever be recovered? Or is it gone forever?
That is the question the region is grappling with. Can you unbulldoze history? Can you rebuild tolerance once it's been dismantled?
A huge thank you to Kim Ghattas' Black Wave for guiding us through this heavy but essential history. And thank you for listening to this deep dive. Stay curious.
And keep questioning.